All right. I think we've got everybody that's going to be joining us. Hello, I'm Ryan with Deque. If you're looking for Agile Accessibility for Good with Dylan Barrell, you're in the right place. We're getting captioning set up as we speak. I've also pasted a link to the stream text if you prefer to digest your captions in that way. You can also access them very shortly from the Zoom caption function in just a moment as we're getting that set up. I want to remind everybody that this session is being recorded. Everyone that is registered will receive that recording via email probably sometime next week. If you can see the shirt that I'm wearing that says digital equality is my jam, we'll be selecting a handful of live attendees and shipping this shirt within the US and Canada only to a few lucky participants. So thank you for joining us, and we'd be thrilled to reward you with this pretty sweet shirt. And we've reserved about 15 to 20 minutes at the end for questions. We'll ask that you use the chat function or the Q&A function within Zoom to communicate those questions. And I'll help to moderate and select those and make sure that Dylan has presented them. Anything that we don't find time for today, we'll make an effort to follow up on. So with that said, Dylan, please kick us off.
All right, love the shirt too, Ryan. I wish I had mine. I have my old Deque University shirt. It's the only one that I have here in Puerto Rico. Very happy to be presenting to you all today in lieu of being in Anaheim. So just imagine you walking along the road, and all of a sudden, out of the water that you're walking next to, this huge beast pops up, and so the beast is blocking your way. You cannot go back. You have to go forward. Your quest is in that direction. So what do? You pull out your sword and you start battling the beast, and you battle the beast and you battle the beast, and all of a sudden you get some advantage and you cut its head off. And you think, oh, I'm done. Great, I can walk, carry on my merry way. And then all of a sudden, where there was one head previously, two heads grow up. That's unfortunately often the way that organizations feel when they first encounter accessibility. They think it's this project that they have to do, and they put a lot of effort into getting the project done. And they get to the end of the project, and all of a sudden they realize that no, that wasn't it. They actually have to carry on. And not only do they have to carry on doing what they've done before, but there's probably a lot of other parts of the organization, other applications and other content that they haven't even thought about yet, and where they need to get active. So why is it that way? Why do organizations feel that way? Well, often it's because the way that they're approaching accessibility is not the right way. They're approaching it as a project rather than as an ongoing thing. And let me explain to you how organizations, as a metaphor, how organizations often approach accessibility in a metaphor as if they were trying to do Agile instead of accessibility. So everybody's heard about Agile, probably done an Agile transformation. So let's do an Agile transformation the way organizations do accessibility. Well, the first thing we've heard about is, and read about Agile, is we need cool spaces to work. We need places where the teams can get together and be social. We need areas where people can chill out and relax. We need a place where the team can work together and collaborate. We need places for the product owners to be. We need to co-locate teams if the teams need to work together. We need great outdoor spaces and views across the city and other places. If there's not those, we need to put up great wall art and all those sorts of things. So we're going to bring an architect in, and we're going to redesign our office. When we do this, we're going to write all sorts of slogans up on the wall. Things like Scrum and Kanban and all these terms, because it's important that when the developers and the development teams come into the space, that they have some terms that they can use to go onto Google and research them so they know what to do, how to do Agile. And then we'll go to the golf course with our executive mates, and we'll figure out what the next great thing is we can do to transform our organization. And that may seem a little bit glib, but that's really often the way that organizations approach accessibility. They don't give their teams the right support. They don't approach it as a change management process when it really is a change management process. And everybody knows that when it comes to change, everybody wants change, but nobody wants to change. But if you don't approach accessibility as a lot of change that needs to take place, you've got old habits that you need to break and undo, and you've got new things that you need to learn. And you need to learn how to do them properly and how to do them well and how to do them consistently. So one of the big issues that you have with change is that developers don't go to work in the morning saying, I'm going to go to work today, and you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to create my application so that 20% of our users can't use it, right? They don't do that. So what is it about development teams that make it difficult for them to even figure out that accessibility is a thing and figure out how to create accessible applications? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that the people on those development teams are living in a little bit of an able-bodied bubble. Most of them are relatively young. They're probably relatively well-educated. They've got relatively high standards of living. And so they don't have a lot of experience with people with disabilities. They probably don't have a lot of experience with people that are older as well. And I know that I'm generalizing here, but this is something that we found with a lot of our organizations, is that I'll often go to a conference, and I'll be standing in the conference on our booth, and somebody will come up to me and they'll be like, hey, what's this accessibility thing? What do you guys do? And I say, well, what we do is we make applications usable by people with disabilities. And I often will get a blank stare, and I'll say, well, have you ever thought about how a blind person can use a cell phone? And I'll get another blank stare, because that's sometimes a very foreign concept. So I'll whip out my iPhone, and I'll turn on VoiceOver, and I'll hold it up to the ear, and I'll navigate around an application, and the person will look at me and say, really, you wrote that software? And I'll say, no, that's not the software I wrote. That's on your phone. That's on every Android and every iOS phone that exists. All you have to do is make sure your application interfaces with that, and then blind people will be able to use your application, no problem. And I see the gears start churning in people's heads as they grasp this concept. And the next thing that then comes up is, well, what do I need to do? What do I need to think about? So there's this bubble that once you burst it, and once you make people aware of the fact that there are assistive technologies, that people with disabilities can actually use a lot of the technology, you just need to think about it. The next thing that developers want to do is they want to learn about that. So how do you leverage that? How do you leverage that, creating that empathy so that developers can be inspired to make the change, to learn the new skills that they need to learn, and to make the changes that they need to make? Well, one of the things that we do at Deque, and you can see on this picture that I'm showing, this photo that I'm showing over here, of what we call an empathy lab. An empathy lab is nothing more than a way to motivate people to learn. And so what we do is we set up different stations, and at each different station, there are opportunities for people to come in and learn something about some type of disability. So for example, what we can see in this picture here is Chris McMeeking, my colleague, showing somebody how a single switch device can be used to control an Android application. And very often people have never seen a single switch. They've never seen a Braille keyboard. They've never seen somebody really try to use a screen reader to navigate an application. So just by giving them the opportunity to interact with these devices, it really gets that empathy going, which is really an engine for learning, an engine for motivation. So we think it's really important to do this at your organization, to inspire both your executives and your development teams to really want to learn, to really want to support the change that they need to make in their day-to-day or the ways that they work. Another very, very powerful way of really showing people what's going on with accessibility is to take their application. Development teams spend hours and days and weeks and months and sometimes years trying to hone their application, make it perfect, make it easiest to use, make it solve all the important problems for the users. And there's nothing more powerful than putting them behind a piece of glass and having a user with a disability come and try to use that application with their assistive technology. and have the developers and designers sit there and see the struggles that they have. I've seen developers go straight back to their cubicles after seeing that and start making changes to their application immediately. It's such a powerful motivator. But it's also a tool that you can use on an ongoing basis. You can bring people with disabilities in. You can do usability studies, whether it's before your application is created, if you're testing some prototypes, or if you already have an application that's developed and you just want to figure out where developers are struggling, where people are struggling with that. So what these are two examples are things that can be embedded into the overall development processes, practices that can be embedded into the overall development process to really inspire the change, to really inspire the learning. And you need to do this on an ongoing basis, because as an organization, you probably have a lot of turnover in your development teams. You probably have a lot of turnover in your organization as a whole, even amongst your executives. And so you need to keep doing these so you can inspire, re-inspire, and get your new hires to also understand the reasons why you really truly are doing what you're doing with accessibility. These are some of what I call the transformation practices. There are 7 of those. I've put them up on the list here. One of the key ways to being successful with accessibility is to have a team whose job it is to manage the transformation. So create a central team. A central team will help to obtain executive buy-in. They can create a policy and accountability for that policy. They can create reports that report on how well the accessibility transformation is taking place. They can make resources available to the teams, things like accessibility coaches. They can create an ongoing empathy program to really inspire people to change. And they can make available learning resources and bulletins for the teams to reinforce their learning, or to allow them to learn while they're doing the accessibility implementations. So designs are super important in making sure things are accessible. And designs often are not that well thought through. And accessibility can sometimes be a lens that identifies usability problems that, once you address those usability problems, make the application better for everyone. So a very good example is maps. Maps are super complex, and in the early 2000s, when Google Maps first came out and started getting traction everywhere, people were putting maps up on their websites just because they could, without really thinking through the implications of why they were trying to use a map. And so, as you can, the screenshot that I'm showing you here shows there's a lot of complex information in any given map. These 2 maps of Florida for different election timeframes. Really, there's a real lot of complex information. Not all of that information can really be represented fully accessibly. A map is an extremely complex thing. But if you think about the reason that you have the map, you can often come up with an accessible version of that application that really makes things better for everyone. A good example of this is Derek Featherstone was working in Ottawa with the city of Ottawa, and they were voting on expanding the borders of the Ottawa city. And so they created this application, they put up a map, and the map showed the border before the expansion and the border after the proposed expansion. And they brought accessibility consultants in and said, how do we make this accessible? And it was an extremely difficult thing to do. Like, how do you describe where the border of a city is? It crosses this road at that point, and it goes across this field. It's really difficult. So what they did as a result was they went and asked people, what are the sorts of questions you would like this website to answer, so that you can make an informed decision about whether to vote for or against this expansion. And what they learned was pretty simple. Most people really just wanted to find out whether any given address was inside or outside the new or the proposed border. And so what did they do? They created a search interface. You could enter an address, you could hit the button, and it would tell you whether that address was going to be inside or outside the proposed border. And that made the application more usable for everybody, because now even people who could clearly see and interact with the old map application it was much easier for them to answer the questions that they had. So that's an example of how accessibility is a lens that can make applications that are better and more usable for everybody. So including accessibility early on in your design process is critical because it allows you to make those changes before you've written any code, which is going to make it much easier to do, which is going to make it much less expensive and get rid of all the waste that you might have in terms of code that's been written that now needs to get replaced. And one of the ways that we do that is we include what we call particularities inside personas. When we started this, we used to create personas that were purely accessibility related, but and that's useful for some teams. For example, yesterday I was talking to a bank, and they were talking about how they create two different personas. One's an accessible persona, and one is a quote-unquote normal persona. But then somebody else was relaying their experience and said that they found that it was much better once the teams had got some basic accessibility expertise, was to actually integrate the particularities into a single persona, which included the accessibility related things as well. And so that's what we have here. Is we have an example of Lucy. Lucy was born blind. It just happens to be one of the attributes that she has, but in all the other ways, she's pretty much a normal user of this fitness tracking device. And so she needs to be able to see her fitness tracker information while she's exercising, which means that taking her cell phone along with her when she's running or walking is not as nice as having the device have some sort of haptic output that she can use to see how she's doing with her fitness. So just integrating these particularities into the persona allows you to think about the application more holistically and find ways that the application can be changed to make it usable by people with all sorts of abilities. Development at its core is ultimately about communication. It's about understanding what the users really want, communicating that in the form of designs and requirements to development teams, and then the development teams understanding that, implementing it, and the testers also understanding those requirements and being able to validate the testing, being able to validate that. So there's a lot of communication that happens in the development process. And when you're doing a development process in a scalable way, in an agile way with accessibility built in, that's no different. The only thing that you need to do is you need to understand the additional pieces of information that the designer needs to communicate to the rest of the development team so that the developer can implement the accessible user interface and that it can be validated, whether that's being done through test-driven development, tests being written first, or whether there's a separate set of people who are responsible for the testing who are going to do that testing. So how do we do this? One of the things that's a great practice that we've adopted at Deque and that we teach our customers is to communicate the design intent very explicitly. So what I'm showing on the screen here is a very small little toolbar. It's a toolbar for a player of some sort. It has 3 buttons. It is a button with a little triangle facing left with a vertical bar. It has a button with 2 vertical bars in it, and it has another button with a triangle facing right with a vertical bar. Now, many of you would identify those buttons and those icons as being kind of very well understood controls for a player interface. So how much information really needs to be communicated about accessibility, about these 3 buttons and a simple toolbar? Well, the answer is a lot. And it breaks down into a couple of categories, 4 different categories I'm going to show you of information. The first is what we call widget name, role, value, and state. So everything here has a role. So for example, those 3 buttons in a row, that's a toolbar. And it also has a name. The name for that is player controls. And each of the buttons inside also has a role. The role is button, and each of them also has a name. Now, if you don't, as a designer, if you don't think about what the name of that icon button should be, and if you don't communicate that to the developer, what's going to happen? The developers are either going to make it up themselves, or more likely, they're just going to not put any accessible name on that button, and that button is going to be completely useless for a blind person using a screen reader, for example. So as a designer, you need to think about these things, name, role, value, state, and when you deliver your designs to the development team, you need to communicate explicitly what those things are. You also need to think about the different states. So every time the visual of any given control changes for whatever reason, you need to think about, why is it changing? What is that change in the visuals communicating? And what do I call that? So for example, on the left, we have the button with a bit of a darker background. Well, what that means that that button is in the disabled state. So if you're on the first track, there's obviously no previous track. So having that button be disabled is the logical thing to do. And you communicate that through the background to a sighted user, and you communicate that through the state to a user of a screen reader. The same thing with the focus state. You need to think about, what does a focus state look like? But not only what does it look like, how do we communicate that to users with different assistive technologies? The second thing you need to think about is, how do users interact with that regardless of the device that they're using? So what might seem quite obvious is how you interact with these buttons using a keyboard. You tab into the toolbar to get to the first button in the toolbar, and then you use arrow keys to go from one button to the other. And when you press the enter key or the spacebar key, it'll trigger that particular button. But then you should also mention what happens if the state is changed by interacting with it. So if I click on the play button and it becomes the pause button, what happens? Where does the focus go? So that interaction, and also what happens to the focus when that interaction happens, are some of the pieces of information that should be included, along with all of your other interaction information that normally gets communicated by your designers. A third type of communication that needs to happen is, what is the order of the overall user interface that we expect the user to read the information in? And then if there are interactive elements embedded into that content, what is the order that the user is expected to encounter those interactive elements if they're using a keyboard type device? And normally what you would want is for those two things to be exactly the same. But I'll show you the second type of annotation that can actually explicitly show you the reading order. Here what we're looking at is an example of a focus order. So we can see that when you tab into the axe Chrome extension, which is really accessible using both the keyboard and a screen reader, the first thing that becomes focusable is the link to the axe core version at the top. The second thing which becomes focusable is the toggle control to toggle the URL or scope functionality, open and closed. When that's open, the third thing that becomes focusable is then the actual link to the scoping description. Then the issues drop down, etc., or going all the way down to the learn more link right at the bottom. All of those things, the order of encountering those interactive elements is clearly laid out. And so now what happens with this, and what happens with a lot of these different markups, is not only can they be used by the developer to implement this, but they can also be used by the tester. And we'll see a little bit later on how they can be used by testers to create automated tests to test the accessibility requirements. So the final type of design intent that we communicate is the reading order. And you can see the exact same screenshot here annotated, showing me exactly how the user is expected to read the content, all the way from the top left, all the way down to the bottom right of this particular user interface design. So for many of you who've been involved in accessibility, when you think about accessibility testing, you probably, Sisyphus is not far from top of mind for you. As Sisyphus was a mythical figure who was condemned to all eternity to push a rock up to the top of the hill, only to have that rock roll down to the bottom of the hill, where he would have to start over again, pushing it back up the hill. And that's really what a lot of accessibility testing feels like at a lot of organizations. And why does it feel like that? The reason it feels like that is because a lot of organizations think that the only way they can do accessibility testing is to do that manually. And just like Sisyphus is a myth, that is actually a myth. Accessibility testing can be fully automated, and I'm going to show you today how you do that. The other myth related to accessibility testing is that accessibility testing is usability testing. And as I said earlier, usability testing with personas or people with disabilities is very important, but it's not accessibility testing. Accessibility testing is really about, have you taken your accessibility requirements and have you implemented those requirements? Can somebody using a screen reader press a button? Can somebody using a screen reader read what the accessible name of that button is? Those things are very clear requirements which are completely testable and don't need a human in order to test them. So how do you do automated accessibility testing? There's two basic approaches that we recommend everybody take. The first thing is get hold of a pre-built accessibility testing library. Now, of course, being from Deque, I'm partial to the Axe library. We built it. I think it's one of the best that's out there. It focuses in particular on zero false positives. And the reason that that's important is because that means you can give it to a developer. The developer can embed it into their automated tests, and it won't break the build unless there's actually a real accessibility problem that needs to be fixed. That's super important for getting your developers to adopt automated testing. And to adopt accessibility is to really just give them stuff that's real. And so Axe is built around that manifesto. We've done many, many different studies on how many of the accessibility issues can be found through a library like Axe. And every time we do these, we've been doing these now for almost 10 years. Every time we do them, we took 65 applications at one of our insurance customers, and we did manual assessments on all 65 of those applications, and we looked at how many of the issues were found through automation and how many through manual testing. It was 50%. Recently, we went through every single assessment that Deque's ever done. We have all that data inside our reporting system. We took all of those and we analyzed that data, and we came up with a number. And what was that number? It was more than 50%. So over a long period of time, we found that this is very consistent. You can find 50% of these with a tool where all you need to do is press a button. You can give it to developers. Developers can press the button and they can fix things before they check the code in. And that's important to get your cost of accessibility down, is to get developers to use these tools before they commit the code into the source code repository. So what does it look like if you build this into accessibility automation? So here we have a test fixture that I'm showing you. And what this is doing is it's saying, setting up the test fixture. It's got a test where it's saying I'm going to do some functionality, and then I'm going to do the accessibility tests. The functionality gets exercised, and at the end of that, when the user interface is in the state that you want to test for accessibility, you simply get hold of a pointer to that particular part of the UI. You pass it into Axe. Axe will run that, and it'll return the results, and then you can do assertions on those results. You can say, I expect the length of the violations array to be 0. And now you have an accessibility test that you can put into your regression testing, and no matter what happens, if somebody every time somebody goes and changes that part of the user interface, if they break something, it'll break the test, and they won't be able to check it into to GitHub. So when we go into Washington, D.C., and we're marching down the middle of the street in the name of accessibility, our mantra is, no code merges until Axe clean. No code merges until Axe clean. And you should get your development teams to do the same thing. So where is the limitation of what you can do with a generic automation library like that? Well, the picture that I'm showing you now is a picture of a woman in a headscarf standing in a crowd of people. And when I put this through one of the automatic caption generators, alt text generators that you can find on the internet, there's quite a few of them these days. The alternative text that was generated for this image was woman standing in a crowd talking on a cell phone. Now let's ignore for a minute that there's no cell phone in the picture. Even if it had got that right, what that automation is not going to be able to do is they're not going to be able to identify that the person in this picture is in fact representative and that the people that she's standing with are the people that she represents in Congress. That sort of meaning often can only really be applied by a human. So when you apply that sort of principle to web applications and websites, where does your meaning come from? Where does the meaning of an application come from? Well, that's pretty clear. The meaning comes from your designs. So if you've annotated your designs correctly with all the information that we talked about earlier, you have all the information you need to now automate the rest of the tests to make sure that that meaning was conveyed correctly from designer to developer into code, and now can be tested by you. And here's an example of a very simple card with annotation markup. You can see that at the top of this card, it has a little pencil icon. That pencil icon has been marked as a button. The accessible name for that button is supposed to be edit and the name of the recipe. So in this case, chocolate cake. So the accessible name for that button should be edit chocolate cake. That is the name and the meaning, therefore, behind that button, which is part of your user interface. We can take that and we can turn it into a unit test. How do we do that? Very simple. The first thing we do in our test is we get hold of that button. So we say, let the button equal query selector button.edit. The next thing we do is we get hold of the name of the recipe. So how do we do that? We have a query selector to find the heading within that particular card. And now we use some of the utilities that are available as part of the Axe library. And we tell Axe to go and get us the accessible name of the heading. And we tell Axe to go and get us the accessible name of the button. And then we compare the two by adding the text edit to the front of the heading text and comparing it to the text of the button text. And now we've got a robust unit test for the meaning of that edit button. If the developer goes and changes that from a button, from using, say, an input with type equals image to a button, well, the Axe library that goes and calculates the accessible text will automatically be able to change the way it calculates that, knowing the different types of elements that they are, and your test will still be robust in the face of that change. So this is another way that Axe can help you with this, but it shows you the methodology that you can use. Very familiar methodologies for any developer or any tester writing automated tests for how you can test accessibility requirements in a fully automated way. So let's see another example, because I talked about, in the beginning, I talked about annotating designs with the keyboard interaction and different device interaction. How do I test that for that device interaction? Here's one way that you can do that. And this is using something called QUnit, which is pretty old. It's part of the jQuery set of tools, but there are very similar things you can do, for example, today with Puppeteer, to actually send real keyboard commands to your application and then test the application to make sure that the correct thing happens. So what are we doing here? The first thing we're doing is, this is testing a menu bar. And if you're familiar with ARIA menu bars, if my focus is in the menu bar on the first menu and I press the left arrow key, what's supposed to happen is that the focus is supposed to wrap around to the rightmost element in that menu bar and focus that. So what we're doing is we're doing that. We're focusing the first element, we're clicking the left arrow key, and then we're testing to make sure that the focus appeared on the rightmost element in that menu bar. And then we're doing the reverse of that. We're hitting the right arrow key and making sure that the focus wrapped around to the first element in that menu bar. And that's exactly the way that you can test to make sure that your device interaction is going to work correctly with a keyboard or a screen reader. Roger Federer, I play a lot of tennis, or when I get the chance to play a lot of tennis. And one of the things I wondered about often was, why does Roger Federer, arguably the best tennis player that's ever lived, at least in the top 2 or 3 ever, why does he have Stefan Edberg come and be his coach? Why does he need a coach at all? And I don't know the real reason that Roger has a coach, but what I think the reason is, and what we've seen from an accessibility perspective, is that a coach often can look at you from a different perspective and can provide you insights that, even if you're very good, like Roger Federer, in understanding what you're doing, in self-reflection, and understanding what sorts of mistakes you're making, that coach can add that perspective that gives you that aha, that really helps you understand what you need to change. And somebody as knowledgeable as Stefan Edberg is going to have different approaches to training, different approaches to different shots that they can share with Roger. And Roger can then make his decision as to whether he's going to listen to that or he's not going to listen to that. But he has that other perspective, which is what coaches are often all about. And accessibility is no different. Accessibility is a set of new skills that you need to learn. And so one of the practices that we recommend for making accessibility stick is not only to just teach your developers or give them learning resources, but to give them coaches that are going to work with them to figure out what they're doing well, what they're not doing well, and how they can work on improving the parts of their game, their accessibility game that need improvement. So what do these accessibility coaches do? Well, the first thing they do is work with the team on achievable milestones, set some goals that the team can use to show success. A good example of this is the first thing we're going to do is we're going to work to make sure that every time we write a new piece of functionality, every time we create a new piece of user interface code, we're going to make sure that that code is axe clean before we merge it. And once everybody in the team is able to do that, and once we've gone through, say, a couple of sprints where that is true, we're going to move on to the next milestone. The next milestone might be that all user interface code will also include new user interface code, would also include automated tests for the keyboard and device interaction. So it's not as important exactly which milestones you set up and which goals you give the teams to achieving that. The key here is to create achievable milestones that you can celebrate as successes and really do that celebration when you hit those milestones. The next thing that a coach can do is set up a dashboard to measure the progress towards those milestones and remind the teams where they are. The third thing they can do is perform spot checks on any new work. They can attend sprint retrospectives and make sure that during sprint retrospectives and during sprint planning, accessibility has been taken into account. And while they're doing all this, they can identify and execute on skills improvement opportunities to help the team improve the work that they're doing. The key thing here is when you're adding accessibility coaches to teams, they're not doing the work. The coach doesn't score the goals. The coach doesn't throw the strikes. The coach helps the players throw the strikes and score the goals. That's the key with accessibility coaches as well. So those are some of what I call the 9 team practices, which can help your teams become efficient and effective in agile accessibility. The full list of all 9 is attend and host empathy events. So if your central accessibility is setting up empathy events, make sure your team members attend them to fill up that vessel of motivation that needs to be refilled every now and again. And host your own empathy events as well. So Global Accessibility Awareness Day is coming up in May. It's a great opportunity for your team to go and host its own empathy or accessibility events and invite other people. Include users with disabilities in your UX design, both in your design thinking and in your testing. Communicate your design intent with accessibility design annotation. Leverage a user interface pattern or design system. Make it accessible. That's a way that you can spread in an easy, effective way, spread accessibility across large numbers of applications with a little bit of effort. Leverage an automated accessibility testing library. Axe is what we think is the best, but if you don't use Axe, use one of the other ones that's out there. Automate your device and assistive technology testing by writing unit tests and integration tests like I just showed you how to do. Manage your accessibility defects systematically. Not every accessibility problem is a problem that needs to be fixed today. In fact, you could argue that there are some accessibility problems that, like some defects, might never get fixed. If it's a random image in your footer which has no meaning or has no real meaning or has no real function or is peripheral, maybe that's something that you can push down out into the future while you work on making things like your forms, your registration forms, your transaction forms, and all that stuff that's really critical to use is while you make that robust and rock solid in accessibility. Make sure that you have a way of equating an accessibility defect with other defect impacts and prioritizing things systematically. Measure your accessibility. Make sure you're getting better. Measure your activities as well as your outcomes to make sure that you not only know what your current state is, but you also have some insight into why the state is the way it is. Accessibility outcomes are great, but if the end result is we're always bad, if you don't have measures of what people are doing and what activities they're doing, there's no way that you can figure out why it's not getting better. So you really need to measure both sides of that coin. And then finally, include accessibility in retrospectives and sprint planning. A lot of these things are laid out in the book that I've written called Agile Accessibility Explained. There's a new version of this that's going to be coming out in May, which we're going to be calling the Agile Accessibility Handbook. Ryan will be sending out a link for those of you who want a copy of this book. We're actually handing them out for free. So please, when you get that email from Ryan with a copy of the presentation and the recording and the link, if you're interested in getting the book, please register. And with that, I'm going to ask Ryan to open it up to questions.
Thanks very much, Dylan. That was fantastic. We've already received a number of great questions, but just a couple of quick notes. You are welcome to submit questions via the Q&A function within Zoom or by pasting them into chat, and I'll make sure to relay those to Dylan. One other reminder, a lot of questions about this one. Yes, this recording will be made available to all registrants probably sometime next week, giving us some time to make sure everything's captioned appropriately and emailed out to everybody. So you'll get the slides, you'll get this recording, and for those interested in the transcript, let me know, and we'll make sure that the individuals that request it will also get that. First question here for you, Dylan. Do you have any recommendations for empathy building strategies for back-end developers who think of their work as decoupled from what's visible on the face of the site?
Oh, that's a good question. I've never got that question before. Well, I would definitely recommend that you try some of the things that we've talked about already, things like empathy labs, because that's just going to help them understand, just at a base level, what it's, at least theoretically, what it's like to try to use some of those assistive technologies to interact with the application. If that's not getting you very far, and you already have an application where there are issues with that application because of whatever the backend developers have done, then doing usability testing where you can really demonstrate that to those backend developers is a good way to approach that. Those are the two kind of generic answers that I have. If you provide more information about the specifics of the issues that you think that they're causing, I could possibly give you some more less generic advice than that, but that's really what I would recommend starting out for sure.
Thanks, Dylan. Another question about empathy labs. How would you conduct empathy exercises with a remote team?
With a remote team, that's a great. Hey, Ryan, do we have an empathy lab presentation? I can't remember if we have one this time around. Do we?
You know what? I would have to double check the agenda. I don't think that we do.
Yeah, it's difficult. I know that Glenda Sims has done some sorts of events that are remote, but really we do recommend trying to do them face to face. There's no easy replacement for interacting with a Braille keyboard than actually touching it. I understand in today's COVID-19 environment that might be a little difficult, but that is the most common way that we do these things today, and the way that really works well for us. Usability studies, we've done quite a lot of those remotely. So there are actually tools, there are accessible tools. In fact, Glenda Sims, if you're interested, we can get Glenda to send out a list of the tools that we've used in the past. But doing usability studies remotely actually works pretty well.
Shout out to a couple of users who have cross-checked our agenda and pointed out that tomorrow we do have a session speaking about the accessibility lab, or the empathy lab, in more detail. I've pasted that in the Zoom chat, so thank you for pointing that out. Okay, next question, Dylan, is I recall earlier in the presentation you were referencing the amount of coverage that automated accessibility testing and Axe provides. You'd mentioned 50%. The question is that 50% of all violations or 50% of success criteria?
It's actually 50% of violations, which is important. There are various different ways you can measure coverage, and it's very difficult because most automated tests, generic automated tests, partially test some success criteria, and obviously the meaning part of it cannot be tested by a generic library like Axe. Meaning always has to be something that the human brings to the table, and that can be encoded in an automated test, but it's not going to be able to be part of a fully automated test. So the meaning part of most success criteria is where these automated libraries fall down. That's why, but what the reason we talk about 50% as an important metric and an important measure is because with very little effort, you can find and fix 50% of the things that actually get broken on average. And that's huge. That means with very little effort, you can make a huge impact to your users. And while you're doing that, I guarantee you, you're going to be doing things. You're not going to just go and add some random alt attribute to an image. You're going to think about that alt attribute, and you're going to add a meaningful alt attribute to it. So I bet you're going to be fixing a lot more than just the 50% that it actually finds. And we have actually seen that. We have seen that there's a kind of a halo effect that happens around this, because as developers start to fix things, they actually end up learning quite a lot and making a lot more changes to the application than just that. But there is still a lot of manual testing. I encourage you to attend the session that I think starts at, is it 4 o'clock this afternoon Eastern time, Ryan? The Meet Axe Pro session. Come and attend that, because what Axe Pro is about how do we do that piece that goes beyond the fully automated and into the manual. How do you do that? Especially, how do you do that with people who might not be accessibility experts? So attend that session, and you can see what Deque's approach is right now to try to fill that gap and make that additional testing a lot easier.
Thanks, Dylan. Next question, can you use Axe for mobile regression?
Can you use Axe? We have an Axe version for Android. I encourage you to go to the Google Play Store and download that application. That helps. And we have 4 pay products that you can use that do exactly the same thing that I talked about with our open source. So we have the Worldspace Attest is the product name, and we have that for Android and for iOS as well.
All right, thank you. What kind of metrics could you recommend tracking on an accessibility scorecard or dashboard?
Well, the 2 simple metrics, if I was to choose 2 metrics, 1 metric for activity and 1 metric for outcomes, I would say start with measuring the accessibility of your applications in production. So use an automated tool like Worldspace Comply to generate a score and a view into all your public-facing information. That's your first outcome measure, and your first activity measure should be how many of your pull requests that you have going into your source code repository. How many of those have automated testing built into them? Those are 2 great metrics to start with. There are a lot more that you could do that are on either side of that, but if I was going to pick 2, I'd say do those 2 things.
Thank you. A similar question on the topic of Axe anyway. How can we align WCAG guidelines across the different platforms? I thought these are mostly for web.
Sorry, you thought, could you repeat that last sentence?
How can we align WCAG guidelines across the different platforms? I thought these were mostly for web.
Oh, no, WCAG is in fact a set of guidelines that can apply to any content. It's web content, but that doesn't mean that it's HTML only. PDF, for example, there are very specific techniques for PDFs, and Android and iOS also have techniques. WCAG 2.1 actually added a lot of additional success criteria to deal specifically with some unique mobile things like touch target size and that sort of thing. So no, it's not purely HTML, but it is everything that you can access via the internet, if you want to call it that. So from that perspective, web being the internet includes native mobile applications, includes document content that might be hosted on the web, like PDFs or Word documents or all those sorts of things. So web content encompasses pretty much everything.
All right, thank you. Next question. How do you recommend adding accessibility into retrospectives, both for teams that accept accessibility as a concern but don't think they have the time, and also for teams that don't necessarily see the value in accessibility?
Well, if the team doesn't have the time, they're probably not going to talk about what they didn't do. I wouldn't start with retrospectives. I'd start with design. I really would, because once the teams learn that if you include accessibility right from the beginning, it's actually not that much effort to do it properly. They'll change their mind. They'll realize that if the design includes all the accessibility requirements, yeah, it's a little bit of extra work, but it's really a little bit of extra work, not a huge amount of work. Retrofitting, that's when they'll see that retrofitting is what costs a lot of time and money, right? Once you've written the code and you now need to go make it accessible, that's painful, it's expensive. But if you can show them if you start off on the right foot, you start off with designs that include your annotations, you create automated tests and use the right tools during development, that what the end result of that is applications that are accessible by default, accessible for good. That's when they'll start to change. They'll start to change their tune.
All right, thank you. What would you say is the best strategy in prioritizing accessibility issues?
The best strategy, it depends whether you're in reactive mode or whether you're in proactive mode. So if you're in a situation where you have some kind of lawsuit and you have to deal with accessibility issues by a particular deadline perhaps, then you're going to take a very different approach than if you're an organization that is doing it proactively and can do it. There's much more leeway in terms of how you approach it. I think some of the things I've laid out today really work well for organizations that are doing it proactively. Do designs, start out with new code, make sure that new code is clean before you ever get to retrofitting or fixing the code that's been there for some time. However, if you're on the other side, what I would do is prioritize the defects on two different axes. And really, you're going to take the upper right as the most important, right? If something is on a highly trafficked, highly important page, and if the defect is high impact, then those are the defects you should fix first. So they impact a lot of people, or they impact critical functionality in your application. And they're blocker level or very high impact on the users. Those are the things you focus on first, and you work your way down. Once you've got all the blocker level things done, you work your way down to the next level of impact until you get to the point where the only things that are left are the things that are on pages that are very lowly trafficked, or are issues that are very low impact.
Great, thanks, Dylan. Does Deque have an enterprise level tool to help with the topics of monitoring, measuring, and managing accessible code? I could not bring that question up. Sorry.
Yeah, we do. We have WorldSpace Comply is our monitoring tool. And then, of course, like I said, there's two sides to the coin. There's no use monitoring unless you're doing something about the activity. We have WorldSpace Attest, which is the set of tools that we give to development teams to help them develop content from the beginning that's accessible. So you really need both sides of those coins. Of course, a lot of organizations choose to start just with the monitoring, but what you're going to get at the end of that is you're going to get the straight line, which is bad, 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 bad. It's not getting any worse. Right? So you really need to, at the same time, figure out how you're going to impact what the development teams themselves are doing.
Great. Thanks, Dylan, very much. I want to make sure we give people enough time to head on to the next session if needed. So tons of unanswered questions.
Disappearing hands.
We're going to do our best to reach out to those of you who did submit questions individually and follow up on them. Again, just a reminder, everyone that registered will receive a copy of these slides and a recording. And at some point also in the near future, you will hear from me and the Deque marketing team with a link to Dylan's book that he had referenced earlier. I know there were a lot of questions as well and interest in where people can get the book. So that's coming. So please stay tuned to your email. Thanks, Dylan, very much. Thanks
Thank you.
everyone who attended. Really
Stay
appreciate it.
safe. Fist bump.